there's an issue with incorporating real Black history in the school curriculum.
Reaching out to local police departments, letting your police chief and your mayor know that it's not acceptable and it's time to defund police.
For things to change, at least on an education level, we have to really sort through what's our real history and how can we show this to the children? How can we show this to the youth?
There's no such thing as Black history. If we say all lives matter, well then all history matters.
Live in a democracy, we need to believe in it, and we need to believe in our institutions. And historically, we've had change with people like Martin Luther King.
Police union that is the juggernaut that stops us from being able to more directly work on reforming police behavior.
Hi, I'm Kara Cruikshank. Welcome to Essential Stories, an independent grassroots docuseries and live roundtable discussions that give voice to people on the front lines of our world's most pressing social issues.
Now we get into the juicy part of asking questions and exploring them. Our listeners, anyone who's joining us on the live stream, you're welcome to write in questions to the panel. We'll get to as many as we have time for. And in the meantime, I invite the panel. Each panelist was invited to bring a question that you would like to more deeply explore with your fellow panelists. Typically on a panel, we speak to what we know. I think this time, this moment that we're all living, it really calls for speaking to what we know and also discovery and resourcing each other to know more. And part of dispelling bigotry of all forms is to listen to those who have been on the shorter end of the stick. So I'll just open the floor now for anyone who wants to bring their question forward here on the panel.
Can't hear myself that well with the headphones. My question is, does anybody, if there's whether it's legislation, but when we talk about education, how we need to reform the education system, I've heard that a lot, but for me, reform in the education system, and I'm gonna ask the question, reform in the education system means a lot of things, but however, the component of history, language, literature, and the reason why I say history is because when we look at the history of the US and symbols like the flag, people don't understand. They're not ingrained. They hijack the meaning of First Amendment. And also with literature and rhetoric, the way we constantly combat it at each other without actually listening to where people are coming from, being consistent with their words, dissecting and identifying falsehoods. So just for like a quick example, there's a video of Candace Owens circling around, and one was shared to me, and then I just couldn't believe it. And people were so, oh my gosh, she's courageous, and just applauding her.
Yesterday, I saw that. Yeah, I'm just saying, I saw the video that you're referring to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing about that is that, for example, the thing about rhetoric, okay, she'll mention something like the amount of crimes committed by Blacks are so much more significant than other racial groups. When, be careful, there's a distinct difference between crime and arrests, unprompted arrests, illegal arrest towards innocence. There's a distinct difference. She knows this. Everybody knows this. This is why I follow Fox News and Ben Shapiro and such. So I know and understand what they're saying. And so when you hear crime, oh yeah, that makes sense. Also, when she talks about, and I'm not attacking her, this is just an example that covers a lot. When she spent so much time on talking about the history and how she dug into the background or criminal record of George Floyd and just this assassination of his character, and much more than I've heard, because there's always the typical routines, assassination of the character of the unarmed Black man who was murdered. Typical, that's tired. But anyway, when she's doing this assassination character, she's taking the mindset of people away, and they're just going, oh, dehumanizing, and everybody still knows that whatever crime he committed doesn't deserve the way he was murdered, but still, it kind of like puts your mind onto, oh yeah, and then diminishes the intensity of the importance of the justice that's right now. Secondly, when she says, I've been digging and doing research, and she was saying all these things and people are convinced, everybody, we have to understand that when you talk about things, you need to reference them. So there's a difference between when a news outlet or, a talking head speaks. There's a difference between someone who says something and it sounds like truth than another person who is speaking something, the real truth, but they'll post an article and a section and a source from it for you to start from. There's a distinct difference. And so we're not aware of that. And then this is still about the educational system. And so with, can I get 1 minute, just 1 minute on this to ask the question for the education? This is the problem. When I went to school in Utah, basically there was a lot of time spent on a Civil War, of course, our American Revolution. And then when civil rights was touched on, it's basically Rosa Parks courageously refused to give up her seat. MLK marched. I have a dream. He was assassinated, and he's a hero of civil rights. That's pretty much it. But I do remember distinctly when we were talking about the Holocaust, there was more in-depth discussion with the Holocaust. And so when you're kind of seeing the atrocities, and you're learning about the Holocaust, you're sensitized. You really see them. And that could be a strong root of this sentiment like pro-Israel, when people have no idea of the nuance in the history of Palestine and Israel. But it's just because Israel is ally association with the United States, Jewish Holocaust victims, then there's that passion. Then there's a lot more to the stories. And another aspect is we celebrate Martin Luther King, in our education, we talk about that. But however, Martin Luther King is not much dissimilar from the bird whisperer in Bernie Sanders, who many of the people in this country despise because they mislabel him as socialist and fascist when he's a democratic social. I'm sorry?
Interrupt, but just want to reroute to what is the question that you want to bring to the panel?
So with all those examples, how do we go about establishing and getting engaged with our legislatures? Because I don't trust the legislatures, because the legislatures have to be smart enough to know that this is a problem in establishing, reworking the education system. Because there's no such thing as Black history. If we say all lives matter, well then all history matters. So there has to be, does anybody know how we get the ball rolling to revamp the education or actually enhance the education system, not cherry pick, to really flush out the history of the US? That's one component. How do we start about revamping an education system? Because I strongly feel that is huge. That's paramount.
So the question is, how do we tackle this on the educational level and the legislative level?
Yeah, because with legislators, they always talk about all this rhetoric, but I don't see, well, obviously I'm not in school right now, but I just see the same kind of ignorance. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but there's just an ignorance, not knowing history. And if people knew history, then There's no way they can speak on platitudes that kind of misrepresent history. It's all over the place. I feel that's extremely important.
Okay, so, but just for the panel's sake, in a nutshell, the question is, how do we tackle these injustices through education and through legislation?
Yes.
All right, cool. So who wants to take it?
Can I respond? Yeah, and thank you for the question. I think it's exactly right. And I would just say part of the problem is the gap between education and what happens in the world. So if we're looking at how George Floyd is killed, that's quote unquote not a legal chokehold. But we know police use that. For those of us, especially on the end of receiving that as our Black experience in this country, we know we're not quote unquote getting what policy is. And that makes it really hard. The youth I teach see that. If I'm telling them to go lobby the legislators, they, in their mind, they're thinking, well, so we pass this policy, police will still be killing Black people. So it's true, it's very tricky. What I try to do is to still push for policy, and that matters. But I also acknowledge the fact that that's not also part of our lived experience and that there's a gap. And we have to do both. And we have to recognize that gap too. And it's also a much harder part to teach, that yes, we live in a democracy, we need to believe in it, and we need to believe in our institutions. And historically, we've had change with people like Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. But it's also true that we have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of gaps in what our democracy can and will do for us. And I think that's really important. I think it's possible to do that and not become schizophrenic and crazy over that. And that's certainly part of our Black journey. But I think we need to, in that sense, have more exposure to the rest of the country, what we're experiencing, for people to understand that. Otherwise, we do run the risk of having things like policy victories and then being at the same point having the same discussion 20, 30 years from now. So I think that's really key what you're bringing up, and that's part of the answer I would offer.
I would like to respond to the question as well. I know, as like one of the youngest people here, I know that my perspective is a bit young, it still has a lot to grow. But I do know that growing up in California and going to school here, I was blessed with a different type of school system. Whereas I know we talked about civil rights and we talked about the end of Black Wall Street and many big Black events, but only for a small portion. And even in these small portions, we were asked upon ourselves to figure it out, to go and research more, to understand ourselves and our history. But I know that most of the country doesn't have the same education system. I know that a lot of our history just from the last 100 years, 200 years is gone. It's jumbled and it's mixed, and they don't want us to know it. They don't want to give it to the youth. They don't want to give us the real answers and who we are, our own identities. So I think to answer your question, I think for things to change, at least on an education level, we have to really sort through what's our real history and how can we show this to the children? How can we show this to the youth in a way where it's not, you can vote and you can go protest to end up dead, to end up on the street and during the same situations, even if you didn't know this information. So I think we really need to compile information and teach the youth a real textbook of Black history.
Yeah, and I would add to that, not just Black youth, but youth of all colors, and especially white youth.
May I speak? Is it a choice? I think that Black history, real history, needs to be part of the curriculum. I do know many teachers, a couple of principals, and that's easily said, but it seems that there's an issue with incorporating real Black history in the school curriculum. And definitely, I believe that is going to be part of resolving things, because what you learn in school, just like you learn the rest of it, and you learn this, and you see other people, you can understand some of who they are, and they'll do the same for you. But it should not only be whites being learned about, but other cultures as well. And then you find that commonality, and that's where it begins. When they go to camp, no one knows anybody, everybody's thrown together, and by the end, everybody knows everybody else, and they're getting along, and everything's fine. But in the beginning, nobody knew anybody, and they were like, "Oh my goodness, who? But it works out. So I think in the classroom is one place where it can begin to work out. at a very young age.
And I want to also add to that, not only Black history, but Black history from both male and female perspectives, which is another big omission in history in general.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Black female contribution often is overlooked, but we're definitely there, a big foundation of what went on and how it goes on. But in the bigger picture, you just try to, support the movement as is, but and not break it up, or cause a distraction. Yeah, that's true. I definitely believe that.
Anybody else want to add to that question before we move on to another one? We have a question from our audience next.
Okay, I just would like to say that I recently learned through Community Resilience Initiative, which deals with trauma and the ACEs, which Elizabeth was referencing earlier, around childhood trauma impacting health even as an adult. And the work that has come out in recent years from Lisa Feldman Barrett about the brain and how the brain functions, and the model that we've used to work with is the reactive fight, flight, freeze. And what they've come to find is that what we really have is a predictive brain. And the neurons in the brain are firing all over the brain all the time to make predictions, because it's more efficient to predict than to react. And so we are constantly making these predictions, and what we have ultimately is an us versus them paradigm. And when we have a them, it creates a threat prediction. And so what we have to do is move from having a threat prediction into having a safety prediction, right? And this education piece that you're talking about and bringing in, Alfred, is a way to do that, to be like, oh, this is not what I think, right? Because we get all this conditioning around what it means to be Black and safety, and like safety, right? Code word. And then we have one experience that'll confirm all that, and then this creates the threat prediction when we really need a safety prediction. And that, I believe, is possible. It's going to take some work by everyone to get there. There's one other thing I'd like to mention from what Darwin was talking about from my drug policy work. Is one of the things that we did is we changed the laws, is there was tracking of the violations of those laws. And then when there was enough of those experiences that were pulled together, then a lawsuit could be filed to dig into it and then create more of traction and enforcement. And so that is one of the ways. And in terms of working with legislatures, Alfred, you're the expert. You're right, there's ignorance. What you got to do is you got to go in there and you got to have a plan. And cities like to model other cities. So, we have to do the work for them. For better or worse, we can talk about it, we can critique it, it's not ideal. But the reality is you can't be an expert on everything. So for those who are carrying the knowledge, you got to bring it to the legislatures and work with them to come into creating the policies. So thank you for listening.
Thanks. So we have a question from the audience, and it is, and if you are listening in, feel free to add more questions. What if the change that is made is only still just incremental, and to pacify the masses in this moment when so many people are protesting? What do we do with that? How do we ensure that this is not a huge investment of energy that leads to a couple of Band-Aids to shut everybody up?
Right. I can take that forefront here in San Diego with a policy change, and it's true, but that you never know what's going to happen. It's like the thing of making sausage. So I worry that people will get scared off before they even try. And in that sense, they're already jaded about politics. There is real substantial change. LA just took money out of the police department. That's never been done before. Something like $20 million out of their budget. That's extraordinary. That's supposed to be sacred. And there's now suggestions, for example, in San Diego, that calls dealing with homeless will not go to the police first, but will be routed to social workers. So there are, I would say, humbly offer, there's some substantial changes that are being discussed, and hopefully these local models can lead to some state and national changes, and we have a real opening now for some substantial changes. But it's true, there's also a lot of symbolic changes, stuff that's just sort of just self-fulfilling stuff for politicians that are running for higher office. And I would just say do the heavy lifting to do that work, analyze it, and really see. And yes, when we get real reform out there, we need to dig in and really fight for it. So I think, I appreciate that question, and it's a really valid one, and it's definitely going to be an ongoing struggle for us.
Thank you. That's exciting to hear some of those updates. I didn't know about the Los Angeles Police Department.
And also, may I mention that it's a beginning. You know, it might be a Band-Aid, but it's a beginning. And these beginnings can enlarge, but you have to start somewhere. Yes, we don't want business as usual after that Band-Aid or that small change has come on, but you got to keep the pressure up and enlarge that change. But it's a beginning. It's a beginning, and you must start somewhere. That's my take.
And to add to that, I would like to say that we can't forget that it's a good fight. It is the beginning, and we're going to keep going. It's not something that's just a trend. This is real, and we have to enjoy our wins. We have to take our wins just as we take our losses. You know, we have to understand that, like, there is change happening. A lot of people don't know what the solution is, but there are multiple solutions that are needed. But right now, as we come up with them, let's embrace it. Let's enjoy these.
Yeah, and I would add personally that we need to look at this not as a momentary outrage, but as a revolution. That is in its core what this moment is. It's the beginning specifically of a revolution of systemic change for what we have known to be dismantled, and something new and much more fair and humane be reconstructed. And if we look at it as a revolution, then it's not going away. But as we gain victories, and victories doesn't mean pushing anybody else down. So for anyone who might be listening who's white and feels threatened, this is not about taking away what is your human right. This is about making things fair for everyone. And in that light, every gain, every win is a win for everyone, regardless of color. And we need to celebrate those wins and use them as our fodder, our momentum to keep going and to not let this become something that subsides over time. So who else brought a question to explore?
The humanity one, that how is it that one person in a household will protest and understands what's going on, but others will not, and they're regarded as good people. They are. They're not monsters. What's missing? What happened there? They're not unintelligent. Some of them are quite educated. But what happened? What did they miss? Where did they fall through the cracks? That's I don't get.
Well, before the panel chimes in, I just want to say that anyone who's exclusively listening to sources like Fox News, there might be some gaps. There might be some educational gaps.
I don't quite have an answer, Elizabeth. What I can say, having grown up in Michigan and have had many conversations with people within my circle, within my extended circle, people that I know over the years, you know, part of what I've been seeking is like what cracks people open on this issue.
Yeah.
You know, what cracks people open. And I don't yet have the answer. My sense of it so far is, you know, I think it's a combination of people getting educated about the real history, like around redlining practices and the impact that that has had on the funding of education for people and the impact that that has on people's opportunities. And there's so much history and there's so much available online that it's really easy now to educate yourself. So that's like something that everyone can do. So getting the facts. Absolutely. And then also having direct experiences with people that counter the narrative of the threat prediction. Mm-hmm. I think that has something to do with it. And this is just me, you know, it's not necessarily based on science or any of that. But I think it takes people holding each other accountable. So, you know, us white people holding other white people accountable, and working to do that. I went for a walk earlier today here in Portland, and real big on someone's front window, it was all blacked out, and then it had white letters, and it says, "If you are silent, you are complicit. Black Lives Matter." It was a little more eloquently spoken, but so I think that narrative is happening around people calling out people for being silent. And I'm also reminded in this moment of Martin Luther King's words of, what you'll remember is the silence of your friends.
Yes.
And, so there's part of it that we have to make it intolerable to be on the sidelines.
Okay. That's a point. Because if you are regarded by, your peers and yourselves as being a decent person, how did you miss that? How did you miss that? How did you fall through the cracks on not understanding? You want to talk about the distractions of the protest, but you don't want to talk about the reason. And like I said, these are,
to speak, sorry to interrupt, but to speak to your point, Amanda, about not being on the sidelines, that can look many different ways. That doesn't mean every single American needs to be out protesting and exposing themselves to COVID-19 and et cetera, et cetera. There are many, many ways you can not be silent.
And, reaching out to local police departments, letting your police chief and your mayor know that it's not acceptable and it's time to defund police and to put those resources into community-based solutions that'll actually give people the support that they need. So, that's a great way to not be on the sidelines and you don't have to be protesting. So there's a lot we can do. Yeah.
Part of this also, to add about the whole thing about the history, is we have that there in terms of things like direct them towards the people's history, Howard Zinn, and that whole thing of bottom up. It's really important for new generations to learn that. It takes time, but they were successful. There has been some really substantial changes in our lives. One of my favorite bumper stickers is "Weekends brought to you by the unions." Most people don't know, for example, history of organized labor. That it used to be legal for 8 and 9-year-olds to work 80 hours a week. So we, in that sense, if you look in that terms of historical perspective, we've had a lot of great successes. But it's true also, a lot of those successes took a lot of lives, took a lot of sweat, blood, and tears, and that's part of it too. It's not just going to be a social media. It's not just going to be liking something, but it's going to take a lot of work, and you're going to have to be patient with it too. That also has to be part of what we teach too.
I believe.
Sorry, jump in there, Jason. I saw you put your blue hand up.
Yes. So this was some bit ago, so it's sort of like, this is like a reaction to maybe tying some of these things together. But I think that, and I also want to answer your question, Elizabeth. I think that to some reason, to some degree, you see people out. It's hard to know why every member of a family is not out. Some have obviously health concerns, et cetera. There's mostly young people out in the street that I saw. Some people can direct their resources towards that young emissary of their family going out, and that sort of thing. But like, I was thinking that, I think it's very important to have discussions about racism, to work on people looking at their programming, et cetera. And I think that the evolution of this is something that takes a long time. We built this, tribalism. We built this us versus them paradigm. We built this fearful prediction that Amanda's talking about. We built this over, hundreds of thousands of years of human history, and we've executed, the selfish results of that in our recent history, and like specifically around slavery, in chattel slavery, and using this as a way for first, wealthy landowners then to use humans as objects and just keep up that, inequality that serves our elite function and throws whatever extra benefits to people based upon their tribal identity, and says to a poor white person, well, at least you're not black. This is how blacks are treated. There's all that, right? But I think that just for the short term, for trying to deal with the questions of, police brutality, the power paradigm has to change. And I think that can change a lot faster in terms of institutional structure. We talk about how institutional racism, brings such a different experience, brings a constant risk to people who don't look white or don't pass as white out on the street. Everybody's, sons or husbands or brothers or father leaves the house, and they're like fearful, that the police is going to, do wrong by them. And that is so legitimate. And I think part of that, and this could be at the hands of police who are white. This could be at the hands of police who are of any ethnicity, because that's the culture of white supremacy. It doesn't mean you have to be a white person to be the executor of the violence of white supremacy. Any person in that role, in an institutional role, could be the one who pulls the trigger on a black man. You know, they don't have to themselves be white. So there is, you know, in looking at that, if we can change the power structure so that those police feel like black people are their boss, you know, when they greet them, you know, when they stop a car and they see an educated white woman, then they say to myself, oh my God, if I treat this woman wrong, she's going to write letters to my manager. She's going to call my boss. She's going to raise a stink. That puts the fear of God in people. Just, you know what I'm saying? They're worried about their job, right? They pull up to, they roll down the window. It's a young black man in there. They're like, ah, shit. If he looks poor too, then they're like, oh, this person has no power. You know, they're not worried. That's where their worst instincts then come to the fore, because they feel like I can step on this person. If that guy has a record like George Floyd, you know, I see this Candace Owens, right-wing prognosticator, right-wing, you know, Blexit spokeswoman dismantling the character of George Floyd, because it's easier for our hearts in this nation to feel like, oh, this man wasn't worth that much. It's okay that he was killed in the street with a cop's knee on his neck. You know, it's easeful for the people whose heart is being hurt by seeing this video. And it helps to take the wind out of the sails of this movement, because then people feel like, well, you know, hey, I don't need to be out there. You know, George Floyd wasn't all that. So it's not about George Floyd. It's about the power structure that makes this guy roll down, you know, makes the window of a car come down, and the cop says, oh, here's a guy who looks poor. Oh, he has no power. Here's a person who's black. Oh, he has no power. He has no institution. I'm not worried about my job. If we can change that dynamic, I feel like that's a faster way to change these outcomes than to look at the longer term question of dismantling people's subconscious racism, because I think that is a very long and deep work that we all have to undertake. But we need structural and institutional change quicker, that's going to have black people feeling safe and make you know, people who are minority communities, at-risk communities, vulnerable communities in charge of the hiring, firing, and discipline of police. So I'm constantly looking for models of that in other cities. I wanted to see the role of police chief here, who is run by, in Portland, we have a city council. We have 4 city council members, and then we have a sort of tie-breaking mayoral seat. Those 5 people run the city here. I've always wanted, and the mayor is the one who's in charge of the chief of police in the police department. I've wanted to see that role not go to a toothless citizens advisory board, but a board made exclusively of highly policed communities within Portland, the most vulnerable communities in Portland. And I want that board to have control of the hiring, firing, and discipline of those police without all of these, you know, barriers to action that exist because of the police union that says they have to have 48 hours to construct their BS story before they even get interviewed when they've shot a person. You know, we have to have a board that is able to deal directly. And to some degree, this is the unfortunate paradigm for Democrats, is that Democratic campaigning works on the muscle of union organizing, and it is a police union that is the juggernaut that stops us from being able to more directly work on reforming police behavior. So in this case, we do have to break the power of that union, which feels wrong to say as a Democrat. And there's most Democrats, they're not necessarily on board with what I'm saying about this. But to me, that is a big issue here in how we can reform the structure and more quickly get to a situation where police roll up and feel like a person of color, or specifically a black man who doesn't look high income, is their boss. They need to look that guy in the eye and say, this is my boss, and to be on their best behavior and feel like the world is watching. That's what I want to see. And I feel like the fastest path in my mind is an institutional path to try to get that.
Thanks, Jason. Elizabeth, I cut you off earlier, and I don't know if there was more you wanted to add to what you were saying.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay.
That those by Jason were very on point. I like the idea that it's something immediate. Yes, in the long run, down the line, Christmas is coming. What are we going to do today? And I certainly like that paradigm about whoever that police officer rolls up to, he's going to extend the proper behavior toward. And that's the key. If it means that we got to take money away, which will get his attention, because you got to do things that, what's in it for me? What's in it for you? Your job. That's going to mitigate behavior. You got it's a what's in it for me kind of mindset, and that'll work.
Thanks. Clash, go ahead and add on there, and then we're gonna we're just about ending our time here, so we're gonna just shift to calls to action as our last segment quickly.
Just to respond to your question, Elizabeth, I think that it's a rare bravery to stand up to injustice, and I know that everyone in my family, we are deep-rooted into the Black Lives Matter movement. But I know that my mother, who is 44, she's afraid for us to go out to these protests. It's 400 plus years of fear being instilled into us to not fight out, and it's the same question asked, like, why didn't all of the slaves run away at the same time? Well, it's a deep-rooted fear that they put into us, and it's tough to have everyone, whether black or white, to fight that, because even if it's an if justice will be served, even if you do the right things, you have the right license, you have the right, this is your house, this is your, you're doing everything right, you can still die at the hands of police, you can still die at the hands of white supremacy, and it's an if justice will be served. It's not certain that justice will be served. So a lot of people are afraid to even speak out or to even be a part of the movement right now because they feel as if it won't matter. They feel like they will die moving for a movement and no one will be moving for them in the same way.
Like, share, and subscribe so that we can make sure that these essential stories are heard by more people.